The desert had a way of swallowing men whole, leaving behind nothing but bleached bones and forgotten promises. Folks in the border towns used to say that no rider who crossed the Red Ember Desert alone ever came back the same, if he came back at all. And on the hottest morning of that cursed summer, when the sun rose like a ball of molten iron over the jagged cliffs, Caleb Rourke saddled his weary horse and began what would be remembered as the last ride across the burning desert. Caleb had once been a lawman in a small frontier town where dust settled on everything, on window sills, on boots, even on the hearts of men. He'd worn a silver star not because he loved the shine of it, but because he believed in something bigger than himself. Justice, maybe, or redemption, but that had been years ago, before betrayal carved its mark across his soul. It started with a gang known as the Black Vultures, outlaws who rode under the cover of night and left towns smoldering behind them. Their leader, Silas Crow, had eyes like a snake and a smile that never reached them. Crow was cunning, patient, and cruel. Caleb had chased him for months, always arriving one step too late, another train robbed, another ranch burned, another family grieving. Then came the night everything fell apart. The vultures rode into Caleb's town just past midnight. Flames licked the sky before anyone could grab a rifle. Caleb fought like a man possessed, firing through smoke and chaos, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. By dawn, half the town lay in ruins. And among the ashes of his own home, he found the one thing he could never replace, a small silver locket that had belonged to his wife, Mara. Mara had believed in him more than he believed in himself. She had a laugh that could melt the hardest winter and eyes that held the promise of better days. She'd begged him once to leave the badge behind, to choose peace over pursuit. But Caleb had chosen the hunt. And now she was gone. They said Silas Crow himself had set the torch to Caleb's house. They said he'd laughed while doing it. For 2 years Caleb searched. He tracked rumors through saloons thick with cigar smoke and along trails that vanished into rocky canyons. He chased whispers across territories where the law meant little and a man's life meant less. Each lead burned out like a dying ember, until the day an old prospector, half-drunk and sunburned beyond recognition, muttered something that froze Caleb's blood. "Crows hiding in the Red Ember Desert," the old man croaked. "Found himself a ghost town out there. Thinks the heat'll keep the devil off his back." The Red Ember Desert was a death sentence. A wasteland of blistering sand and jagged stone, where water dried up before it touched the tongue and the wind howled like a grieving widow. No sane man crossed it alone. Caleb left at dawn the next day. The first days were a trial of endurance. Heat pressed down on him like a physical weight, making each breath a labor. His horse, Whiskey, trudged faithfully beside him, its flanks slick with sweat. Sand crept into every seam of Caleb's clothes, rubbed his skin raw, and turned his thoughts hazy. At night, the desert turned cold and merciless. Caleb wrapped himself in a threadbare blanket and stared at the stars. They seemed sharper out there, closer somehow, as if the heavens themselves were watching his journey. He spoke to Mara under that endless sky, confessing regrets he'd never voiced aloud. He told her he should have listened. He told her he'd trade every ounce of vengeance for one more moment by her side. On the 5th day, a sandstorm hit without warning. The horizon darkened, and a wall of swirling grit roared toward him. Caleb barely had time to tie a cloth over his face before the storm swallowed him whole. Wind screamed in his ears. Sand lashed his skin like 1,000 tiny knives. Whiskey panicked, rearing and nearly throwing him off. "Easy, girl," Caleb shouted, though his voice was lost in the chaos. He dismounted and huddled against the horse's side, shielding its eyes while the storm raged. Minutes felt like hours. His canteen slipped from his grasp and vanished beneath shifting dunes. When the storm finally passed, the desert looked different, unfamiliar and menacing. Landmarks he'd been following were gone, and his water was nearly finished. But as the dust settled, he saw something in the distance. A spire, crooked and skeletal, rising from the sands. A church steeple. He urged Whiskey forward with renewed strength. By late afternoon, the outline of a ghost town emerged from the heat haze. Buildings leaned like tired old men. Windows were shattered. Doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. And there, tied to a hitching post outside what had once been a saloon, were horses. Caleb's pulse thundered. He dismounted silently and tied Whiskey behind a crumbling stable. The town felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. He crept along the wooden walkway, boots barely making a sound. Voices drifted from inside the saloon. Told you he wouldn't make it, a man laughed. Desert eats fools like him. Caleb froze. Another voice replied, low and smooth as oil. Don't underestimate a man with nothing left to lose. Silas Crow. Caleb's hand tightened around his revolver. He kicked the saloon doors open. The room fell silent. 6 men turned toward him, hands hovering near their guns. And at the center of them, lounging in a chair tilted back on 2 legs, was Silas Crow. Crow smiled slowly. Well, I'll be damned. Caleb Rourke. Thought the desert would have claimed you by now. It still might, Caleb said evenly. But not before I finish this. Chairs scraped against wood as the outlaws stood. Crow held up a hand. Now, boys, let's not be rude. The man's come a long way. He stood and faced Caleb, eyes glinting. You really think killing me will bring her back? Caleb's jaw tightened. No, but it'll stop you from taking anyone else. A tense silence stretched. Then someone twitched. Gunfire exploded in the enclosed space. Caleb dove behind a table as bullets tore through the air. He fired back with deadly precision, fueled by years of rage and regret. One outlaw fell, then another. Smoke filled the room, stinging his eyes. A bullet grazed his shoulder, sending white-hot pain through him. He gritted his teeth and kept shooting. When the smoke cleared, only 2 men remained standing, Crow and one of his lieutenants. The lieutenant lunged for Caleb. They collided, crashing through a table. Fists flew. The man was bigger, stronger, but Caleb fought like a cornered wolf. He slammed his head into the outlaw's nose, felt bone crunch, then grabbed his fallen revolver and fired point blank. Silence fell again. Crow stood alone now, revolver trained on Caleb. You should have stayed buried in your grief, Crow said softly. Caleb rose slowly, blood soaking his shirt, his own gun steady in his hand. Maybe, he replied, but then who'd stop you? They fired at the same time. The shots echoed like thunder. Caleb felt the impact, like a mule's kick to his side. He staggered but stayed upright. Crow blinked in surprise. A dark bloom spread across his chest. His gun slipped from his fingers. He fell. The world seemed to tilt. Caleb dropped to one knee, breath ragged. He stared at Crow's lifeless body, expecting to feel triumph. But there was only emptiness. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ghost town. Caleb stumbled outside, each step an act of will. He reached whiskey and leaned heavily against her. He'd done what he came to do. But the desert wasn't finished with him. Blood loss made the horizon sway. He mounted the horse with difficulty and turned back toward the endless sands. The ride back would be harder. He knew that. Night fell as he rode, stars blazing overhead. At some point, he slipped from the saddle. When he opened his eyes, the sky was painted with dawn. He lay in cool shade. Voices murmured nearby. A caravan had found him. Traders crossing the desert with wagons full of supplies. They'd seen his horse wandering and followed it back to him. You're lucky, one of them said. Another hour out there and you'd have been done for. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness as they tended his wound. Weeks later, he stood on the edge of a different town, watching children run through dusty streets. The world hadn't changed. The desert still burned. Men still sinned. But something inside him had shifted. He took the silver locket from his pocket, the one he'd found in the ashes. He held it to the light and whispered a quiet goodbye. He would never escape the desert entirely. It lived in him now, in scars and memories. But he didn't have to let it define him. Caleb Rourke had ridden across the burning desert seeking vengeance. He returned having found something else. Not peace, not fully. But the first fragile step toward it. And in the end, that was the true last ride across the burning desert.